Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been getting a lot of listener questions and feedback on a really important topic, and it's something we've touched on before, but we wanted to take a deeper look, and that is how agriculture intersects with countries that are facing fragility and conflict.
Yeah,
It's a topic that a lot of times, can get kind of simplified, right? Like you think of just emergency food drops, but there's clearly a lot more to it than that.
absolutely. And the Q&A that you sent over with Holger Cray from the World Bank, you know, it's a really good springboard for us to kind of really understand the nuances here.
So that's kind of our mission with this deep dive, right? We want to kind of get past that surface level and really explore how agriculture in these challenging places, isn't just about providing, a meal for today, but it's actually, kind of this foundational piece in building long-term stability and the ability to bounce back from shock. So, our core question here is what exactly is that relationship between agriculture and fragility, and how can, a focus on farming and food systems offer a genuine path towards a more secure future.
Maybe a good place to start is, Cray highlights this fundamental challenge, and it's something that's kind of a common thread in fragile and conflict-affected states,
Yeah.
and that's persistently low per capita income. And so, what that really means for those of you listening is that there's limited ability to access, good quality and diverse food,
And
right?
it's not just about empty shelves.
Yeah.
It's about what people can actually afford.
Exactly.
And then, even kind of drilling down a little bit further, it's not just about the consumers, right? It's about the very people who are growing the food, who are trying to farm in these really challenging situations. They're also
Yeah,
in a very precarious position,
that's right.
in terms of being able to even afford the inputs they need, right? Like good seeds or fertilizers to nourish their crops, or even adequate feed for their livestock. So it's a tough starting point.
It is, and he even goes on to talk about how, um, this lack of access to resources for farmers basically, kicks off this, damaging sequence of events, what he refers to as a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
So, how does that play out in practical terms?
Well, I think of it like this, right? If farmers can't invest in their land and their production, their yields suffer, right?
Yeah,
So they have less production, which means they have less income,
that's right.
which means they're even less able to afford those crucial inputs for the next season.
Yeah,
So it's like this kind of self-perpetuating downward spiral, right?
absolutely.
It traps these communities in extreme poverty and makes them incredibly vulnerable.
Now, what's fascinating here is that the challenges don't stop there, right? We're talking about getting food from the field,
Yeah.
to people's plates, and even that whole journey is faces all sorts of hurdles in these environments, right?
Yeah, he talks about how, even if food is grown, getting it to where it needs to go is a massive challenge, right?
Yeah,
We're talking about unreliable energy supplies that are impacting food processing and storage, or logistical nightmares that make transportation,
yeah,
incredibly difficult. So even if there is a potential, supply, it doesn't always translate to, food on the table for people who need it.
yeah. And something that stood out to me was, um, you know, his point about the public sector in these regions. It's not just a lack of resources, but sometimes it's about effectiveness of governance itself.
Yeah, and that's a really important layer, right? Because he suggests that, in fragile states, the ability of the government to actually implement, sound agricultural policies or to effectively manage natural resources
Yeah.
can be really significantly weakened. And that just further compounds the issue.
Exactly. And so if we can, connect this to a broader global challenge, we can see how these existing vulnerabilities are sort of, turbocharged by, external shocks.
Mhm.
And I think, perhaps the most significant of those today is climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. And Cray doesn't mince words, right? He says that climate change is, quote, the greatest threat to food security that we've seen.
Wow.
And, the shift in the frequency of severe weather events is honestly pretty alarming, right?
It is.
Because we used to see, a major climate-related food crisis in Africa roughly once every 12 years, but now it's happening on average, more than 4 times as often.
Really?
So about once every 2.5 years,
Wow.
which really, just kind of underscores that escalating risk.
Good. And, he illustrates this, in places like Malawi or Madagascar, where the impact in regions with a single rainy season can be absolutely devastating.
It really brings it into focus, doesn't it? Like that fragility.
Yeah.
Because you imagine your entire year's food supply is hinging on one rainy season for your maize crop,
Right.
and a single failure or even just poorly timed rains, can wipe out everything.
Yeah.
So that's the knife edge that, so many people in these vulnerable areas are living on.
And then you factor in, a global crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic,
Mm.
and you see how those pre-existing vulnerabilities can be amplified in really dramatic ways.
Yeah, no question, right? Because,
Yeah.
we saw with the lockdowns and all the kind of widespread disruptions that the pandemic brought, that led to a further drop in per capita GDP in fragile countries.
Yeah.
And that, of course, pushes even more people into poverty and, worsens their access to food. And you see that really dramatically in the difference in how food prices were affected. So while, average food price inflation in Africa was around 12%, conflict-affected countries saw a staggering 30–40%
Right.
increase.
Wow.
So it just paints a picture of the added hardship there.
So we're looking at this really complex web of interconnected problems.
Yeah.
But, the conversation with Cray then pivots to, a really important point, and that's that agriculture's role goes way beyond just providing emergency food assistance. It has, this multifaceted impact.
Yeah, that's right. And he really emphasizes, that agriculture is this primary source not just of food, but of jobs and income,
Yeah.
for a huge number of people in these regions. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting is the social dimension that he highlights. And that's, its role in fostering inclusion, particularly for women.
Yeah, and that's not something that, might immediately come to mind. So how exactly does agriculture contribute to greater inclusion for women in these challenging contexts?
Well, he talks about how, in many fragile settings, agriculture offers a space where women can gain, a sense of dignity and,
Right.
and have a more significant voice, in household and community decision making.
Interesting.
So it can be a pathway, to economic empowerment and greater social standing for those who are often very marginalized.
And so beyond, those vital social and economic benefits,
Hmm.
agriculture also plays this, really critical role in the health of the environment
Yeah.
in these often fragile landscapes.
Yeah, exactly. He talks about what's called landscape resilience, and you can think of it like this healthy vegetation cover. So things like trees and grasslands acts like a sponge,
Interesting.
right? Helping the land to retain soil, improve water absorption, and even capture carbon from the atmosphere. So it's kind of like this natural infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
That makes these areas less susceptible to those kinds of extreme weather events that we were just talking about.
So given, this really broad and important role of agriculture,
Yeah.
How does an organization like the World Bank approach this complex set of challenges, in countries facing fragility and conflict?
Well, he makes it really clear that their main focus is on the long game,
Yeah.
on fostering long-term development.
Yeah.
So their goal is to really help these countries build those underlying systems, the infrastructure, the local capacity they need to either prevent conflict and fragility from taking hold in the first place or to recover effectively from it, over time.
Yeah.
And so they're not primarily, a first response emergency organization, but they do have ways of addressing immediate needs.
Right. And he gives some specific examples of, these more immediate responses, such as providing livelihood kits. Can you sort of expand on what those involve?
Yeah. So, when there's a natural disaster, let's say, a major flood wipes out a farming community's crops. The World Bank can step in really quickly and provide those farmers with the essential inputs they need for the next planting season, right? So things like seeds and fertilizer so that they can kind of get back on their feet and start producing food again. So it's about bridging that immediate gap.
And he also mentions a more proactive tool called early response financing, and that sounds like a way to kind of get ahead of potential crises.
Exactly. It allows them to intervene, the very early warning signs of a potential food crisis with the aim of, preventing things from escalating into a full-blown catastrophe. So it's about early action to mitigate those worst impacts.
And to really illustrate how, these different strategies come together in practice, he offers this really insightful case study, South Sudan.
Yeah, South Sudan is a country facing, immense challenges, right?
Yeah.
Widespread hunger, severe climate shocks, and of course this ongoing conflict. So he explains that, the World Bank is tackling this through a dual approach. So on the one hand, they're running an emergency locust response project. So dealing with those kind of immediate threats like pest outbreaks. But crucially, this also involves building the country's long-term capacity to
Right.
manage such threats, right?
Okay.
So it's not just about the immediate response, it's also about building resilience
Right.
for the future. And alongside that immediate response, they're also running a project with a much, longer-term vision, and that's focused on strengthening agricultural livelihoods
Yeah,
in the more stable parts of the country.
right,
So the aim there is to boost agricultural productivity in those regions
right.
so that, South Sudan can build this more secure foundation, for feeding its population in the future.
Okay.
So it's about fostering greater self-reliance over time.
So it's evident that agriculture is this really vital piece of, this complex puzzle.
Yeah.
But, Cray is very careful to emphasize that it can't be the only piece, right?
Absolutely. He stresses that, a successful and sustainable strategy, requires this joined-up approach, right? So alongside, supporting the agricultural sector, there's this critical need to focus on creating jobs, restoring livelihoods, more broadly promoting trade and overall economic growth and ensuring a stable macroeconomic environment. So all of these elements need to be working together.
And he shares this, really compelling example of how this holistic approach can make a tangible difference.
Yeah.
That's northern Uganda.
Yeah, and this is really a powerful illustration of how things can change.
Yeah.
Because just 20 years ago, northern Uganda was known primarily for the violence and instability that it faced, but now it's experiencing this real agricultural transformation
Wow.
with this, thriving private sector that's providing farmers with the technical support and the connections to markets that they need.
Interesting.
It's even become, a key source of food for aid efforts in neighboring South Sudan,
Really?
which is a remarkable turnaround.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, and that kind of leads, right into, this next key area that Cray delves into, which is the crucial role of the private sector.
Absolutely. And, you know, he makes this fundamental point, right? Agriculture, at its heart, is a private sector activity.
Yeah.
Whether you're talking about, small family farms or larger commercial operations, these are entrepreneurial endeavors. And the government's role, he argues, is to create, the right policy framework and regulatory environment
Yeah.
that allows those private actors to flourish.
And it's not just individual farmers, right?
Right.
It's the contributions of, private corporations and other businesses all up and down the value chain that are also absolutely vital.
Absolutely. They play an essential role in supplying those critical inputs that we talked about earlier, seeds, fertilizers, insurance products to protect farmers, access to banking and financial services, agricultural machinery. And Cray also points out that even in fragile and conflict-affected settings, the private sector is often quite active, even if, much of that activity takes place within what's called the informal economy.
Right.
Right. And perhaps most importantly,
Yeah.
For long-term sustainability and
Yeah.
growth, the private sector is this crucial source of development financing.
Right, because the scale of investment needed to truly transform these economies is, far beyond what international aid organizations
Yeah.
and philanthropic efforts can provide on their own.
Yeah.
So this is where the private sector, with its, ability to mobilize, significant capital, becomes really indispensable.
Yeah.
And he highlights the role of the World Bank Group, in facilitating this through organizations like the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which, supports the growth of businesses in developing countries, and MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, which provides insurance against, political and non-commercial risks to encourage, international investors to venture into these more challenging environments.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, what would you say is the central message that really stands out regarding the relationship between agriculture and fragility?
Well, I think for me, the core takeaway is that in fragile and conflict-affected situations, agriculture is so much more than just an immediate response to hunger.
Yeah.
It's a fundamental building block for long-term resilience, for fostering greater social inclusion, and really laying the groundwork for lasting recovery and stability.
And it's so important to remember that, the development of the agricultural sector doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Right?
It's deeply intertwined with, broader economic and social factors.
Absolutely. It's most effective when it's part of a, comprehensive and coordinated strategy.
Yeah.
That addresses job creation, promotes overall economic growth, and works towards lasting stability.
And that, really prompts a final thought for you listening. Consider how this seemingly basic act of farming, of cultivating the land, can become such a powerful tool for fostering peace and development in the most difficult and volatile regions of the world. It truly highlights the complexity and the potential for positive change, even in the face of immense adversity.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time.
Bye.
Bye.